9 minutes. Live on air. That's all it took for the room to fall dead silent. J.D. Vance leaned in, eyes sharp, voice steady, and in front of millions, he exposed a secret Jasmine Crockett had buried for 3 long years. A secret that no one saw coming. Not her team, not the audience, not even Jasmine herself. She had laughed just moments earlier, smug, untouchable. But when J.D. spoke those 13 words, you could almost hear her heart stop. The cameras kept rolling. The crowd didn't move. And across America, people watched something rare. A reversal so stunning, so raw, it didn't feel scripted. Because in that moment, it wasn't. And maybe that's what makes stories like this matter. Because while the names you're about to hear are public, what follows is a dramatized reconstruction. A fictional retelling inspired by the tensions and truths of our times. The characters are real, the emotions are real, and for many watching, the impact will be personal. So if you were in that seat, with the nation watching, and your past was unmasked in the 13 words, how would you respond? Don't look away. What happens next doesn't just reveal a secret, it reveals something about all of us. The hallway behind the CNN town hall stage was lit with a muted green hue, not from the overhead fluorescence, but from the spill of stage lights pushing through the thin black curtain that separated the chaos of the cameras from the quiet just beyond them. J.D. Vance stood in that stillness. No, he wasn't scrolling his phone. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't speaking to aides or adjusting his tie. He was holding a single folder in his left hand, slim, dark blue, unmarked. His right hand rested gently on top of it, fingers twitching in unconscious rhythm. His eyes weren't on the curtain. They were closed. From the other side, the audience roared in bursts, reacting to the woman already seated under the spotlights. Jasmine Crockett's voice sliced through the muffled barrier. Sharp, deliberate, cutting. You can bring books, you can bring binders, you can even bring speeches ghost-written by billionaires, but you can't bring what matters most, lived experience. There were cheers, some laughter. Someone in the back shouted, "Preach!" into a live mic. J.D. didn't flinch. He had heard worse, in war zones, in Senate back rooms, on Twitter. But tonight was different. He opened his eyes, calm, glassy. He could feel the heat of the lights even from behind the curtain. They weren't just stage lights. They were interrogation lamps. And he had walked into them willingly. On the wall to his left, a small screen showed a live feed. Jasmine sat in profile, dressed in a pristine white suit, her hair tightly coiled, her posture flawless, her tone commanding, her rhythm rehearsed but fluid. She wasn't here to debate, she was here to dismantle. J.D. looked down at the folder. Inside, 5 pages. No backup, no tech team, just 5 pages. And a handwritten note clipped to the front. Use this only if she forces your hand. The handwriting wasn't his. A low beep came from the earpiece, coiled at the nape of his neck. A stagehand appeared beside him. 2 minutes, Senator. You good? J.D. gave a slight nod. No smile, no answer. Just still. Then, another eruption from the crowd. Jasmine had just dropped his name again, this time with a grin that was all performance. Mr. Vance talks like someone who studied courage in textbooks. I've lived it. The audience ate it up. J.D. stepped forward, letting the light hit the tips of his shoes. He took one long breath, like a diver before breaking the surface. His voice, unheard to anyone but himself, whispered under that breath. 3 years, Jasmine. You really thought it would never surface? The lights blinked once, signaling go time. But still, he waited. Not out of hesitation, but calculation. He wasn't stepping onto a stage. He was stepping into a trap, and he was bringing a match. The silence J.D. Vance had carried backstage was shattered the moment the curtain lifted. On the stage, Jasmine Crockett was already in command. Not just of the mic, of the entire room. The CNN town hall set glowed around her like a boxing ring dipped in velvet. Her white suit shimmered beneath the studio lights, standing out like a battle flag against the deep crimson backdrop. She didn't pace. She glided, One hand rested on the armrest of her chair, the other moved with precision as she punctuated every point. She was halfway through a sentence when JD stepped into the wings, unseen by the crowd, but visible now to her. "You know, I've read J.D. Vance's memoir," she said, her tone light, a smile flickering at the corners of her mouth. "Touching stuff, real salt-of-the-earth pain. But folks, let's get one thing clear. A memoir is not a national security strategy." A flash of laughter erupted from the crowd, loud, spirited, but not unanimous. In the second row, a woman in a navy pantsuit stayed stone-faced. Beside her, a younger man with an Air Force pin on his lapel exchanged a glance with a colleague. The audience was split, energized but wary. Chris Wallace, seated at center stage, let the wave of reactions crest before lifting a hand gently. He leaned forward into his mic, tone neutral, as if trying to place a lid back on a boiling pot. "Thank you, Representative Crockett. Now to offer his response and perspective, Senator J.D. Vance." The applause was respectful but measured. Some leaned back in anticipation. Others whispered. Jasmine turned her gaze toward the curtain. Not confrontational, but composed. She folded her hands in her lap like someone watching a chess opponent make their first move. Her expression said one thing: "I'm ready." JD stepped into the light. His shoes clicked softly against the floor. Slow, deliberate. He didn't look at the crowd, not yet. His eyes locked briefly with Jasmine's. No nod, no smile. Just a glance that lingered long enough to register something quiet. Not fear, but memory. Then he looked at Chris Wallace. "Thank you," he said simply, before taking his seat across from Jasmine. There was no introductory small talk, no handshake, just tension. Chris posed the first question. It was expected, about border policy. JD answered with calm precision, citing recent briefings and on-the-ground reports. The crowd listened politely, but their body language made one thing clear. They were waiting for the clash, and Jasmine gave it to them. She interrupted gently at first, a correction on a timeline, then sharper, a jab about lack of military service. And finally, "You can't just talk about protecting America when you haven't spent one day in the line of fire, Senator." A sharp inhale from the crowd. Chris shifted slightly. Even the cameras adjusted, zooming in on JD's face. He didn't blink. Instead, he slowly reached into the folder now resting on the table beside him. One hand, one motion. He lifted a single sheet of paper, glanced at it once, and then met Jasmine's eyes. "That's true," he said, "but I wasn't the one who ordered the redaction." The sentence dropped like a stone in still water. No explanation, no context, just wait. Jasmine's lips parted, just slightly. A beat of silence hung in the air, and something flickered behind her eyes. He didn't need to explain. Not yet. That would come next. And when it did, the floor beneath them wouldn't just shake. It would burn. For a moment, it felt like J.D. Vance hadn't heard the question at all. He just sat there, his fingertips resting lightly on the edges of the folder he'd brought with him. He didn't shuffle papers. He didn't clear his throat. His eyes scanned the crowd slowly, then settled deliberately on the woman across from him. Jasmine Crockett was still smiling, not mockingly, but confidently. Her chair was turned slightly toward him, posture relaxed, legs crossed at the ankle. She looked like someone who had already calculated the ending of a story before the second act had even begun. JD finally leaned forward, his voice low but clear. "I came with receipts," he said, "not rhetoric." The line dropped into the room like a pebble in glass. There was a murmur of curiosity, followed by a sudden hush. Chris Wallace tilted his head slightly, interested but cautious. Jasmine raised an eyebrow, just enough to register amusement. There was a faint chuckle from her, the kind that says, "That's all you got?" JD didn't respond to her expression. He didn't respond to the silence either. Instead, he did something unexpected. He closed the folder, and then he didn't speak. He waited. 10 seconds, maybe more. An awkward beat by television standards. An eternity in a room built for sound bites. The audience shifted. One man in the back coughed. The producer in the control booth signaled to hold the camera. "Don't cut, just wait." JD's silence wasn't indecision. It was strategy. Jasmine finally broke the moment with a light scoff and leaned back. So the receipts come with suspense too, she quipped, drawing another ripple of laughter. But JD didn't smile. Instead, he unfolded a document, one page only, and slid it across the table toward Chris Wallace without saying a word. Wallace glanced down, eyebrows knitting slightly. Is this? Chris began, but JD cut in, calm and direct. A redacted transcript of a Homeland Security Subcommittee meeting, closed door, one representative present, one vote that swung policy on migrant intelligence gathering. Now the silence returned, but this time it was heavier. Chris blinked. Jasmine tilted her head. Her smile hadn't vanished, but it had stopped growing. JD turned to the audience now for the first time. Not grandstanding, not rallying, just speaking. I'm not here to argue with Representative Crockett's charisma or her performance. I'm here because national security isn't a game, and somewhere between the headlines and hashtags we've lost the thread. But the truth, the actual record, that's still there, waiting to be read. He tapped the edge of the folder. I came with it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. But there was something in the way he said it, measured, grounded, that unsettled the energy in the room. Suddenly, the roles felt less certain. Jasmine's next words would matter more than ever. Not because he had attacked her, but because he hadn't. Chris Wallace cleared his throat, clearly unsure if the conversation had shifted into a minefield. Representative Crockett, do you wish to respond? Jasmine leaned forward now, slowly. Her smile reappeared, practiced, poised, but in her eyes a calculation had begun, a flicker, a clock ticking. Because if JD really had what he claimed, this wasn't just another debate. This was the start of a controlled burn. Jasmine Crockett didn't miss a beat. The moment Chris Wallace gave her the floor again, she leaned in. Not physically, but with tone, with tempo. The rhythm of her voice shifted. The lightness from before faded just enough to reveal something sharper underneath. Precision and fire. Let's be clear, she said, eyes locking on JD Vance. We're not talking about an ordinary citizen here. We're talking about a man who once called NATO obsolete, who flirted with dismantling the CIA, and who still claims experience while writing memoirs from a seat nowhere near the front lines. A few people clapped, quickly like they weren't sure if they were supposed to. JD didn't move. He didn't flinch. But the room did. The studio lights didn't change, but the heat rose. Jasmine had that effect when she spoke with conviction. Her voice didn't shout, it surged. She quoted him verbatim, moments from years past, speeches from podcasts, offhand comments on talk shows that, in her delivery, became damning. Let's not forget, she said, that this is a man who compared the intelligence community to a shadow government, who said, and I quote, "We need to rethink the very premise of American power abroad." Another ripple moved through the room. Chris Wallace stiffened slightly in his chair. The control room switched to a wide shot, sensing the energy was no longer debate. It was something else now. A direct challenge. A campaign within the event. A public dissection. Jasmine turned to the crowd. Not dramatically, just enough to widen the arc of her voice. The difference between the two of us isn't polish, she said. It's proximity. I've been in the trenches of legislation. I've sat across from grieving families after domestic terror attacks. I've briefed with national security advisors. And he's theorized from the bleachers. She looked back to JD now, eyes narrowing slightly. So forgive me if I'm not impressed by a receipt that arrives 9 minutes late and smells like vintage distraction. This time the laughter was louder. Not uproarious, but affirming. Controlled applause from her side of the aisle. JD still hadn't spoken, and that silence and so powerful moments ago now began to stretch thin. Not weak, but exposed, vulnerable. Jasmine pushed forward. The real issue isn't whether JD brought a document. It's whether he brought accountability. You can quote transcripts, Senator, but you can't redact your record. The line landed hard. Even Wallace let out a faint exhale. For the first time, JD shifted slightly in his seat, not to react, but to brace. Jasmine's words weren't just pointed, they were layered. She wasn't only undermining his policy stance, she was questioning his relevance, his place in the room, his right to be in this particular arena. She had built a storm, and now it hovered over the stage, heavy and electric. Still, JD said nothing, and that made the moment ache with anticipation. Viewers could feel it. Something was coming. The blow had landed, but the counterstrike hadn't arrived. And when a man like JD Vance waits, it doesn't mean he's speechless. It means he's calculating. As Jasmine sat back, a slight smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Satisfaction, but also awareness. She had drawn first blood. She had shaped the battlefield. Now all eyes turned to him, and in the space between their gazes, the audience could sense it. Something far bigger was about to surface. JD Vance didn't rise to the bait. He didn't shift in his seat again. He just smiled. The same smile he'd worn when Jasmine first mocked him off stage. It wasn't smug, but it wasn't soft either. It sat somewhere in between. Thin-lipped, unreadable, but anchored by eyes that didn't blink. Behind that smile was restraint, not retreat. And under that restraint, something colder moved. He didn't glance at the crowd, didn't throw a quick quip or force a chuckle. He simply held Jasmine's gaze with an expression that refused to react. If she wanted theater, he wouldn't give it to her. Not yet. His silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. Chris Wallace finally broke the tension with a subtle lean forward and a voice that tiptoed the line between moderation and provocation. Senator Vance, do you wish to respond? JD looked at Wallace, then back at Jasmine, and for a moment it seemed he might pass. But then, with that same measured calm, he spoke. Congresswoman Crockett has every right to her opinion, he began, and to her style. A slight lift in his tone, almost gracious. Almost. I'm not here to match punchlines or win applause breaks. I didn't come for the theater. He paused just enough to let the audience lean in. I came for something a little less entertaining and a lot more uncomfortable. Truth. There it was. Quiet. Centered. A phrase designed not to outshine Jasmine's flair, but to sink in deeper. JD kept his eyes forward, but his words, now slowly unfurling, carried weight. We live in a time where performance often outpaces principle, where viral moments matter more than verified ones. I'm not against that. I just refuse to be distracted by it. His voice didn't rise, but the steadiness in it created its own tension. He spoke like a man who had watched storms come and go, and no longer flinched. I know what was said about me. I've heard it all before. NATO, CIA, sound bites and summaries with no context. But I also know something else. Something quieter. Records don't lie. Votes don't vanish. And decisions made in silence often speak louder than the ones screamed into microphones. No immediate applause, no big crowd reaction. Just the hum of attention tightening. JD finally broke eye contact and looked down briefly at the small stack of notes in front of him. Not to read them, but to signal he didn't need them. You want to talk about proximity to pain? He asked, voice dipping into something more personal. Let's do it, but not tonight. Not with cameras rolling, not for entertainment. Real pain doesn't perform well, it doesn't monologue, it just waits. And some of us have lived there long enough to recognize when it's being used. He didn't look at Jasmine again, but the implication hung in the air like a silent gavel drop. There was no outburst, no immediate comeback. The room had shifted again, from the heat of confrontation to the quiet of confrontation's aftermath. JD sat back, hands folded. That smile still rested on his lips, but now it felt different. It wasn't a deflection, it was armor, a smile that didn't flinch, because the man behind it knew the next move wasn't going to be made with words. It would be made with revelation. The table was glass, but the sound echoed like thunder. JD Vance, in one precise motion, placed a thin black folder onto the desk between him and the moderator. He didn't slap it down. He didn't gesture wildly. He simply set it there. Deliberate, quiet, deadly. Let's begin with fact, he said, voice low but unmistakably clear. The audience murmured, unsure if it was theater or substance. A few cameras instinctively zoomed in. Even Wallace turned slightly in his chair, glancing at the folder as if it might open itself. JD didn't look up. Instead, he leaned forward, his fingers finding the clasp of the folder like a pianist finding the first note. And then, he opened it. No fanfare. Just a single sheet of paper. White, one corner slightly curled. Across the top, in bold red letters, Confidential, House Ethics Committee. Time stopped. Even the light seemed colder. Chris Wallace's lips parted, but no words came. Jasmine Crockett, still poised, arched one brow ever so slightly. The smirk had vanished, not from fear, but calculation. She was reading the room, sensing the shift in current. Something had changed. The air itself had thickened. JD didn't gloat. He didn't even speak right away. He let the camera catch every inch of that paper's heading. And when he finally broke the silence, it was with surgical restraint. This document, he said, was not leaked. It was not forged. It was submitted, reviewed, and filed by the bipartisan House Ethics Committee 3 weeks ago. He slid the paper slightly toward Wallace, who instinctively reached for it, more as anchor than curiosity. The name redacted on this copy belongs to a sitting member of Congress, one who has repeatedly spoken on ethics, oversight, and transparency. One who, until now, believed her platform made her untouchable. Gasps, not many, but enough to break the atmosphere wide open. Jasmine's eyes didn't move. Her posture didn't falter, but the muscles behind her cheekbones tensed just enough for anyone watching closely to notice. She wasn't rattled, but she was preparing. JD's words continued, not louder, just heavier. I didn't want to bring this tonight. I hoped this wouldn't be necessary. But when you spend half your airtime questioning my allegiance to this country while knowing what's in your own file, I stopped staying silent. He turned slightly, now facing Jasmine directly for the first time in several minutes. You want to talk proximity to pain? To power? Let's also talk about proximity to impropriety. The crowd was no longer murmuring. It was frozen. Chris Wallace blinked, lips pressed into a line. He didn't read the document aloud. He didn't have to. The presence of it, its bold red heading and understated delivery, did more than any monologue could. Jasmine finally moved. Just her fingers. They curled slightly on the edge of her podium. Not from shock, but readiness. Her jaw tightened, and when she inhaled, it was the kind of breath people take right before battle. Not defense, not retreat, counterstrike. But she didn't interrupt. She let the silence sit, let the implication bake. Because she knew, and JD knew, the folder may have hit the table, but the real story was just beginning to unfold. JD Vance didn't rush. He let the tension stew for just long enough to make everyone lean forward. Then he gestured subtly to the production team behind the stage. A beat. Then the screen behind him flickered to life. At first, just the sterile glow of an email inbox. Then zoom. A single message filled the screen, framed in digital clarity. The subject line read, Media Summary, Unvetted, Urgent Share. The timestamp glowed beneath it, 6:42 a.m., Tuesday. The sender's address, leah.t@house.gov. IP metadata appeared in the bottom corner, like a fingerprint in neon. Attached to the message was a file, tx14 talkingpointsdraft.pdf. JD turned his head just slightly, letting the audience take it in. This email, he began calmly, was sent by a senior staffer in Representative Crockett's office to a local press contact 3 hours before a hearing that included classified briefings. The crowd didn't gasp this time. They were past gasping. They were staring. Reading. The file, JD continued, contained a raw internal summary. It was marked as a draft. It was never reviewed by committee. It referenced quotes and statements pulled from closed-door briefings, language that was supposed to remain inside this chamber. He looked directly at Jasmine now. You said my memoir doesn't qualify me to speak on national security, but at least I don't leak fragments of it to boost local optics. The room was still. A few reporters were already typing furiously on their phones. Chris Wallace adjusted in his chair, visibly uneasy but restrained. That's when Jasmine stepped forward. No hesitation, no stumble, just a quiet but sharp pivot into the storm. "Let me be clear," she said, voice steady. "That document was a staff draft. It was not a leak. It was not classified. And it certainly doesn't represent any ethical violation." JD didn't interrupt. He folded his hands, almost as if inviting her to continue. "Emails between staff and press are standard," Jasmine added. "What's not standard is weaponizing them in front of a live audience without context." She turned slightly, facing the screen now, then back to the audience. "You're seeing a narrow slice of something bigger, and that's intentional." Her tone sharpened, just a notch. "Anyone who's worked in Congress knows we prepare summaries. Some are clean, some are messy, some are never meant to leave the desk. But to call this an exhibit in some kind of moral trial? That's not facts, that's theater." A small murmur from the back rose. Not disapproval, just the sound of people processing. Jasmine took a breath, measured but not defensive. "You want to talk ethics, JD? Let's. But don't pretend your silence earlier was noble when it was calculated, and don't mistake a draft for a dagger." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was surgical. JD didn't flinch, but something in his posture shifted. He'd landed his first blow. She had parried. Now they were both inside the ring, gloves off, stakes rising, and the question hanging in the air wasn't who would win, but what would be revealed next. JD didn't let the room recover. He stepped forward again, his fingers gliding across the table as he retrieved a second sheet from the black folder. "If Exhibit A raised questions," he said, voice low but resolute, "Exhibit B answers them." He held up a printed statement, thick with annotations, highlighted sections, and a signature block at the bottom. On the screen behind him, a scan of the same document appeared, filling the backdrop like a silent verdict. Statement of James L. Cardosa, former Chief of Congressional Security Oversight Division. Date, May 27th. Signature, present and verified. JD didn't dramatize it. He didn't have to. This is a sworn declaration from James Cardosa, who served as Chief of the Security Oversight Division for 7 years. Last fall, he submitted a report flagging irregular document distribution from Representative Crockett's subcommittee office. He paused, not for effect, but precision. 2 weeks later, he was reassigned, no warning, no review, just a sudden internal transfer. The weight of the statement began to settle in the room like fog. On the screen, one sentence glowed in yellow. "The report I submitted highlighted premature access given to non-cleared aides, potentially breaching committee protocols. Within days, I was removed from my position without formal explanation." The silence was no longer curious. It was uneasy. JD read the next line aloud. "I believe my reassignment was not a coincidence, but a consequence." His voice didn't rise. It deepened, like something settling into place. He sent that report upstream. It was logged, tracked, then he vanished from his role. And the questions he raised never answered. Not internally, not publicly. He stepped aside, allowing the words to linger on the screen behind him. Across the room, the body language had shifted. Chris Wallace leaned forward slightly. Audience members sat with still hands, eyes fixed. The kind of silence that makes even coughing feel intrusive. JD turned back to Jasmine. There was no triumph in his expression, just steadiness. "This isn't theater, Congresswoman. It's testimony." Jasmine, for the first time that evening, did not respond immediately. Her expression was unreadable, not shaken, but calculating. Then slowly, she approached her mic. "I'm not going to delegitimize a man's experience. I don't know why Mr. Cardoza was reassigned, but I do know this. If there were real violations, there are formal channels, and you didn't take them. You brought it here, into the court of public chaos." JD met her words with a small nod, as if he expected exactly that reply. "You're right," he said. "This isn't a court, but sometimes the only way to force a response is in the open. When silence isn't an option." No one laughed. No one clapped. The room had shifted from spectacle to scrutiny, from debate to something heavier. For the first time, even Crockett's most vocal supporters seemed less certain. The story had taken a turn, And no one, not even Jasmine, could predict where it would lead. For a few long seconds, the stage held its breath. Jasmine Crockett stood behind her podium, her fingers lightly gripping its edge. The rhythm of the night had changed. No longer the commanding order dominating applause, she now stood in the unfamiliar terrain of defense. Her voice, moments ago sharp and unwavering, now carried a slight tremor. Chris Wallace, maintaining the air of a seasoned moderator, broke the silence. His tone was firm but not unkind, the voice of a man asking a question on behalf of a nation. "Congresswoman," he said, turning toward her with a steady gaze, "do you deny that these events occurred under the direction of your staff?" Jasmine blinked slowly. Her lips parted, then pressed shut again. For a moment, the only sound was the quiet buzz of studio lights and the faint shuffling of camera crew behind the scenes. She reached for her water but didn't drink. When she finally responded, her voice came softer than before. Still composed, but just enough to register the subtle shift. "What I deny," she said, eyes locking on Wallace before shifting to JD, "is that any decision was made with intent to deceive or mislead. Staffers are entrusted with rapid communication. Sometimes errors are made. But this," she gestured toward the screen behind her, still displaying Cardoza's signed statement, "is being weaponized to discredit oversight." There was conviction in her words, but it no longer filled the room. It echoed instead against the silence. J.D. Vance remained seated. He didn't speak, didn't interrupt, didn't react. He sat perfectly upright, hands resting on the folder as if weighing the very word judgment. His silence, paradoxically, said more than rebuttal ever could. Chris Wallace leaned slightly forward. "So for the record," he said slowly, "you acknowledge the document is authentic. You acknowledge the reassignment occurred, but you suggest the implications are misinterpreted?" "Yes," Jasmine replied, "and no, I acknowledge what's on paper, but I reject the narrative being built around it." The subtle phrasing was deliberate, but the hesitation before it, the pause, the recalibration, was unmistakable. In the audience, a few heads tilted. Whispered comments passed between rows like wind through dry grass. Jasmine cleared her throat. "Let's not pretend this is unusual. Every office has turnover. Every committee wrestles with urgency. What we should be talking about is policy, not paperwork, not passive-aggressive accusations in prime time." Her attempt to shift the narrative was deft, practiced, the maneuver of someone seasoned in political storms. But something was missing. The punch, the righteous force that carried her opening salvo, had dulled. And still JD said nothing. He looked at her not with disdain, but with something more dangerous: patience. He was letting her speak, letting the room absorb not just her words, but the strain behind them. The confident rhythm of her voice was cracking just slightly at the edges, like porcelain beneath pressure. Wallace gave a small nod, turning back to the camera. "And so we arrive," he said, "not at a conclusion, but at a turning point." His voice held the authority of a verdict, and for the first time that night, the audience didn't seem sure who held the upper hand. This wasn't about who shouted loudest anymore. It was about who carried the heavier truth. There was a pause, long enough for tension to curl back into the room like smoke. J.D. Vance leaned toward his microphone, calm but resolute. "With your permission," he said, eyes on Chris Wallace, "I'd like to call someone forward." The moderator blinked, surprised. "We don't usually permit," but J.D. raised a hand, not to interrupt, but to assure. "This won't take long, but it matters." Chris Wallace hesitated, then gave a small nod. J.D. turned slightly toward the audience. "James Keller." A hush fell. For a moment, nothing happened. Then from the second row, a man stood. He wasn't the kind of figure you'd expect to shift the weight of a national conversation. Mid-60s, gray hair combed with care, an old lanyard still hanging from his belt loop. His suit was clean but worn. His face bore the calm of someone who had waited years for this moment. And when he began to walk toward the stage, he didn't do it with flair. He did it like a man walking back into something he'd tried to leave behind. The cameras turned. The audience leaned forward. J.D. stepped back from his podium as Keller approached, giving him space. No introduction, no biography. Just silence. Keller took a breath, adjusted the mic, and began. My name is James Keller. I served as Internal Security Liaison in the Office of Congressional Administration from 2011 to 2023. I'm here because I filed an internal report, and 3 days later, my badge was deactivated. The words hit like drop stones. He continued, or not rushed, not rehearsed. In late October of last year, I intercepted a flagged packet that had been routed through the House network, labeled Outreach Summary, Bypass Clearance. It had the metadata of a draft intended for press distribution. It hadn't gone through the vetting channels. That's a violation. I documented it, submitted it through the chain. He paused, swallowed. 2 days later, I was asked to take a voluntary reassignment to archives. Pending departmental reorganization, they said. I declined. The next morning, my office access was revoked. Gasps broke out in the back rows. On the screen behind him, JD cued a scanned copy of the internal incident report. It was dated, watermarked, signed in pen, James Keller. October 27th. Wallace's eyes narrowed as he read along. Keller looked up, his voice tightening slightly. I am not here to accuse the Congresswoman personally. I don't know who approved what. I don't pretend to know their intentions. But I know what happened to me. I know the cost of speaking up. And I know when silence is used as a weapon. It wasn't grandstanding. It was grief wrapped in formality. Jasmine Crockett stared at the stage, unmoving. Her lips were pressed into a line, arms crossed, but not in defiance, in calculation, a woman measuring the storm. J.D. didn't look at her. He looked only at Keller. Thank you, J.D. said quietly, for coming forward. Keller gave a small nod and returned to his seat. No dramatics, just the slow exhale of a man who had finally spoken the thing he wasn't supposed to. Chris Wallace turned to the camera, visibly unsettled. The balance of the evening had tilted again, not because of a revelation, but because a human being had stood and made it real. And now in a room once filled with sparring and applause, the only sound left was breath. The silence that followed James Keller's return to his seat was thick, not reverent, not hostile, just bracing. It was the kind of silence that made people afraid to even shift in their chairs. Then Jasmine Crockett spoke. Her voice was sharp, her tone unmistakably offended, but there was a crack just beneath the fury, the kind that comes when control begins to slip. This is a political hit, she said, eyes narrowed at JD, then scanning the audience. A manufactured moment dressed up in fake gravitas. You're not investigating, you're staging theater. JD remained still, hands folded. He didn't even blink. Chris Wallace turned gently toward her, measured, neutral. Congresswoman, he said, the edge in his voice sharper than before, do you deny knowing Mr. Keller during the March internal security briefing? The words landed like a pin dropped in a cathedral. For the first time all night, Jasmine Crockett didn't have an immediate answer. She looked at Wallace, then quickly to JD, then out into the audience. A scanning motion, but without focus. Her fingers tapped once against the podium, a silent metronome of calculation. The camera zoomed in, catching the flicker in her eyes. Something between recognition and restraint. I've attended dozens of briefings, she said finally. I don't personally remember Mr. Keller being present at that one. But you were at that March briefing? Wallace followed. She hesitated. Too long. Yes, I was, she said at last. But again, I don't recall seeing or interacting with him. The camera caught everything. The slight twitch in her jaw, the clipped tone that had lost its edge, the pause that no politician is supposed to let linger, a flicker of uncertainty. And for a split second, it hung in the air like a scent of smoke. Wallace turned back to JD, who hadn't said a word. Not since Keller left the stage. Jasmine noticed. That silence, more than any accusation, gnawed at her composure. This entire exercise is designed to erode trust, she snapped. Not just in me, but in institutions, in process. This is about headlines, not truth. But even as she said it, the crowd felt the shift. Some still nodded, her supporters unwavering. But others leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed, brows furrowed. It wasn't that they believed JD entirely, but they were no longer sure she had nothing to hide. Wallace didn't respond immediately. He let the silence speak, just long enough for it to echo. Congresswoman, he said carefully, this isn't a court of law, but it is a matter of public trust. You're not being asked to defend an accusation. You're being asked a simple question. Did you know this man was silenced after flagging misconduct under your jurisdiction? She opened her mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. I don't believe I was informed of any such retaliation, she said. And if there was, I will make it my duty to find out who authorized it. But I won't let my reputation be used as a punching bag in someone else's campaign stunt. It was a strong sentence, the kind of sentence meant for headlines, but the room no longer responded with applause. Not immediately, because while the words rang out, her voice had dipped just slightly in volume at the start. It was enough. J.D. raised his eyebrows, ever so slightly, but said nothing. The audience felt it, the shift from performance to pressure. And behind the curtain, far from the spotlight, a producer whispered into an earpiece, "She's slipping." Eyes on Crockett. Stay wide, then go in close when she exhales. The game had changed, and everyone knew it. It didn't happen all at once. No gasp, no exclamation. Just a subtle drawing back. Chairs creaking slightly as audience members leaned away rather than forward. The applause that had once greeted every retort from Jasmine Crockett had faded. Now the room was quieter, almost reverent, but not in her favor. The silence wasn't empty. It was expectant. Chris Wallace sensed it immediately and pivoted his posture ever so slightly. His shoulders angled more toward J.D. now, less toward the congresswoman who once held the floor. Across the country, Twitter feeds lit up with a single phrase, #JD Receipts. It started with a journalist's live tweet from the fourth row. He hasn't raised his voice once, but every folder hits like thunder, #JD Receipts. By the time it hit 5,000 retweets, someone had clipped the moment Keller walked on stage. A grainy shot of Jasmine's flickering reaction trended in under 10 minutes. Some of her defenders called it a smear campaign. Others simply paused. Inside the studio, J.D. Vance remained still. Not smug, not triumphant, just composed. He hadn't taken a single verbal jab at Jasmine all night. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't delivered monologues. But what he had done was harder to dismiss. He had changed the tempo. "I didn't come here to accuse," J.D. said quietly, addressing no one and everyone. "I came here to clarify." Even the tone of his voice felt different now. No longer cautious or tentative, it carried a quiet gravity. The kind people lean into. A sound that suggested there was more to come, but only if the listener was willing. Jasmine Crockett shifted her weight behind the podium. Her eyes scanned the audience again, but this time not for allies, for tells. Who still believed her? Who was slipping? Where had the center gone? She could feel it, like a room where the thermostat had dropped just 2 degrees. But you knew. J.D. reached for the folder again. This time he didn't open it. He merely rested his hand on the black cover. "It's easy," he continued, "to make this about sides, left or right, insider or outsider. But we're not here for party lines. We're here because the public deserves clarity, not rhetoric, not dismissal, not theater." No cheering followed, but heads nodded, quietly, earnestly. Jasmine's lips parted, as if to respond, then closed, a breath held. Chris Wallace looked toward her, waiting, but not pressing. This wasn't his story anymore. The room was writing its own. Outside, producers watched a second screen as the #JD Receipts hashtag merged into trending news. Cable networks picked it up, breaking it down frame by frame. One commentator whispered, "He's not attacking. He's eroding." And it was true. J.D. hadn't thrown a punch. He had built a room and slowly, carefully, invited people inside. One exhibit at a time, one sentence at a time, and that room was beginning to shift its foundation. Crockett's brow furrowed as she leaned into the mic. "The facts matter," she said, her voice firmer again, "and so does context." But it was too late. The audience wasn't rejecting her, not yet, but they weren't clapping either. They were waiting. And in politics, waiting can be more damning than outrage. The camera pulled back to a wide shot. Jasmine at one podium, J.D. at the other, Wallace in between. But the emotional weight had moved. The center of gravity was no longer where it started. In every story, there's a moment when the tide turns, not with thunder, but with a whisper. This was that moment, and JD had done it without ever needing to shout. Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. The air had shifted. That much was undeniable. But Crockett had faced colder rooms. Rooms that doubted her. Rooms that judged her before she ever opened her mouth, and she had survived every single one. So when the silence hung like a verdict, she straightened her back, eyes flaring, and struck. "This isn't clarity, this is choreography," she declared, voice rising. "You came here with a script, a media-friendly narrative, and now you're playing the role they wrote for you." Gas flickered through the audience. Not loud, but real. Some from surprise, some from relief. The tension had finally broken. "You're not here for truth, JD," she pressed, pointing across the stage. "You're here because the conservative machine needed a face, and they picked one that looked like you. Calm, polite, dangerous." Her words hit sharp, almost surgical. Every syllable deliberate. It was the old Jasmine again, fearless, defiant, and unwilling to let someone else set the tone. JD didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He let the accusation linger in the space between them, absorbing the force without rebuttal. Then he offered the softest response of the evening. "Sometimes," he said gently, "the truth feels staged, because it's too consistent." A pause, measured, and then he added, "But that doesn't make it false." The room didn't shift back, it didn't erupt, but the audience leaned in again, pulled into the tug-of-war now unfolding in real time. Jasmine stepped away from her podium, closing the distance slightly. "You drop files. You bring in men with folders and sad eyes. And you expect people to believe you're not part of something bigger?" "No," JD replied. "I expect them to listen, then decide for themselves." The sparring wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It was colder than that. Two people armed with conviction, circling a center that neither could fully claim. Each word was a move. Each silence, a strategy. Jasmine turned to the moderator. "Chris, we've heard a series of disconnected anecdotes and internal memos, but nothing ties me personally to wrongdoing." Wallace raised an eyebrow cautiously. "Congresswoman, are you denying any knowledge of the emails, the testimony, the redacted files from your own office?" "I'm denying the spin," she fired back. "People make mistakes. Staffers overstep. But to conflate that with intent, with guilt, that's not oversight. That's assassination." The word echoed. Even Wallace seemed to register the intensity. JD finally stepped forward, just one small step, hands still behind his back. "I agree," he said. "We should never conflate error with evil, but we should also never confuse silence with integrity." And just like that, the temperature dropped again. For a moment, neither spoke. Jasmine's chest rose slightly faster now. JD's voice had grown even softer, the kind of softness that cuts deeper because it doesn't ask for attention, only consideration. Somewhere in the back, a phone screen lit up. A quote posted live: "Silence is not integrity." Already climbing the algorithm. Chris Wallace cleared his throat. "We're entering our final half hour. Both sides will have a chance to make closing arguments." But both sides had already started. Not in statements, but in stances. In the rhythm of counterattack and restraint. In the way truth was being fought over. Not by force, but by presence. This wasn't about who shouted loudest. It was about who held steady longest. And Jasmine Crockett had just reignited the match. But JD Vance wasn't flinching. JD Vance didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room had already been trained to lean in when he moved, when he blinked, when he breathed. And now as he reached calmly beneath the desk and retrieved a final sheet of paper, just one, the air all but stopped moving. "There's one more document," he said quietly. He placed it in front of him like a chess piece, not a bomb. Then he looked directly at Jasmine. "And I hope you'll let this speak for itself." He didn't hold it up for the cameras. He didn't pass it to the moderator. Instead, he pressed a small button, and the screen behind them came alive. White page, redacted lines. But one sentence remained perfectly clear, highlighted in stark yellow beneath an email thread header. We'll deal with him later. Let's keep this internal. The sender, a senior staffer, the recipient, Jasmine Crockett. The signature below, Heron, and below that line, in bold print, approved, JC. The room didn't gasp. It rumbled. An immediate involuntary, ooh, rose from the audience like the swell of a drumbeat. Not staged, not rehearsed. Just the sound of something undeniable crashing into real time. For the first time all evening, even the cameras hesitated, unsure whether to cut away or zoom in. Jasmine's eyes locked onto the screen. She didn't speak, didn't blink. For a long, taut second, the room wasn't watching her answer. It was watching her absorb. Chris Wallace turned, voice hushed. Congresswoman Crockett, is this your approval stamp? She didn't reply immediately. Instead, she stepped toward the podium, fingers brushing its edge like she was feeling for something real, something steady. Then finally she answered, It appears to be. But you're showing a sliver of a thread, not the full context. You have no idea what we were dealing with internally. JD said nothing. Let me be clear, she added, firmer now. That line, whatever it sounds like, isn't a confession. It was about internal protocol, not retaliation. JD didn't smile. He didn't interrupt. His expression was not triumphant, only focused. The kind of quiet intensity that made it impossible to accuse him of theater. Chris Wallace nodded slowly. And who was him referring to in this thread? Jasmine paused. It was the pause that changed the tone. Not defiant, not defensive, just delayed. A staff member, she said, a junior one. There had been complaints, and we were assessing next steps. There it was again, that flicker of ambiguity. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was heat, and the room could feel it. On Twitter, the hashtag was now #DealWithHim, rising, mutating, spreading. And still, JD didn't push. He simply stepped back, hands folded, letting the silence do what cross-examination could not. Wallace cleared his throat again, guiding the discussion forward. But the audience wasn't moving on. Neither was the moment. Because this wasn't just about paperwork now. It was about perception. And the perception was clear. Something had cracked. Not shattered. Not collapsed. But cracked. Visibly, audibly, publicly. And J.D. Vance hadn't needed to shout, spin, or accuse. All he did was present. One document, one sentence, one signature. And for the first time, Jasmine Crockett looked like she might be reading the room instead of writing it. For a second, no one moved. Not the moderator, not the camera crew, not even the audience, who had just moments ago erupted in one collective ooh that still seemed to echo between the rafters of the studio. And Jasmine Crockett, the fighter, the firebrand, the one who'd never backed down from a microphone in her life, did something no one expected. She looked down. No eye contact, no rebuttal, no reaching for papers. Just her hands resting on the podium, motionless, and her gaze lowered as if trying to read the grain of the wood rather than face what was in front of her. It wasn't a collapse. It was something quieter, more human, an unraveling. Chris Wallace opened his mouth, then stopped himself. He checked his earpiece. The producer's voice in his ear was firm. Take control. Now. He leaned forward. Ladies and gentlemen, Wallace said, tone measured but taut, we're going to pause for just 30 seconds to settle the room. Please, let's allow the process to continue with respect. It didn't help immediately. The audience murmured and stirred. There were a few scattered shouts. Answer it! You signed it! Tell the truth! But they were met with sharp glares from others who just wanted to understand what had shifted and why it mattered. A red pause light lit up on the stage. The live feed was momentarily cut. The clock stopped. Jasmine still hadn't spoken. Behind her, a large monitor looped silently through the last document again. That line, "We'll deal with him later," seemed to burn brighter the longer it stayed on screen. In his chair across the room, J.D. Vance had returned to his seat. His hands were clasped in front of him. He didn't look smug. He didn't smile. He didn't even glance toward the crowd. Instead, His expression held something else. Not triumph, not relief, something heavier. Sadness. It was subtle. Just a small pull around the corners of his eyes, a slight tension in the line of his mouth. But it was real. He looked like a man who had walked through fire not to burn someone down, but to bring something painful into the light, and now regretted that it had to be him. A stagehand moved silently to adjust a microphone. Wallace scribbled a note on his tablet, and then Jasmine finally stirred. She didn't speak, but she lifted her head. It wasn't the defiant lift of someone ready to fight back. It was the controlled, exhausted rise of someone who knew that the worst moment wasn't the shouting or the exposure or even the accusation. It was this, the stillness afterward. The 30 seconds ended. Wallace glanced up. "Congresswoman, you may respond if you'd like." Jasmine took in a breath, shallow, measured, and then simply said, "I'll address everything after this hearing. I owe my district an explanation, and they'll get one." In full, there was no applause, no cheering, just the flat hum of resolution. JD said nothing, and for the first time, it was clear. This wasn't a game to him. There had been no joy in it, no pleasure in the cornering, no pride in the takedown, only gravity. What had begun as a televised debate now sat like a judicial reckoning, slow, solemn, and irreversible. And somewhere in that silence, the country realized what it had just witnessed. Not a political win, a breaking point. The air was still heavy. The lights above the stage buzzed faintly, but it was the kind of silence that wasn't just quiet. It weighed on people. Crockett remained at her podium, staring straight ahead now, unmoving. No tears, no panic, but the armor was gone, stripped by evidence, by testimony, by the quiet betrayal of documents that bore her own signature. The crowd had settled into an uneasy quiet, waiting for someone, anyone, to speak first. J.D. Vance stood. It wasn't a political move. It wasn't for drama. It wasn't even entirely planned. He just stood up slowly, walked toward her across the studio floor, and stopped 3 feet away. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point fingers. Instead, in a tone that held no edge, just clarity, he said, "I didn't come here to destroy you." That line didn't echo. It landed, like truth does when it stops trying to impress and simply speaks. "I came to remind America that standards still matter." There it was, not a jab, not a final blow. A quiet declaration, offered without venom. The words didn't seek to wound. They sought to reset something. The crowd didn't stir. The cameras stayed tight. Then he extended his hand. Not in victory, not in reconciliation, and certainly not in pity, but as an offer, an invitation to exit the stage with dignity, to rejoin the realm of accountability with some measure of grace. He wasn't asking her to forgive. He wasn't even asking her to admit. He was offering her the smallest remaining choice in a story that had already closed so many doors. To leave standing. Jasmine looked at him. Really looked. There was no spark of fire left in her, but there was recognition. Not of defeat, but of truth. And in that moment, 2 things could be true at once. That she had made mistakes, and that being allowed a way out was not weakness, but mercy. She didn't take the hand. Not yet. But the fact that it was there changed everything. Chris Wallace said nothing. No commentary, no transition. He let it hang in the air, because some gestures didn't need analysis. They needed to be felt. JD's hand remained outstretched, steady. Somewhere in the upper gallery, a woman placed her hand over her heart. Not in patriotism, in empathy. Because whether or not you liked either of them, whether or not you cared about party lines or committee emails, what you were watching now wasn't politics. It was human. Finally, Crockett moved, not toward the hand, but toward her microphone. She pressed the button. Her voice came out low, controlled. "Congressman, I hear you." Just 4 words, not an admission, not a collapse, but a signal. The fire may return another day, but today she would not pretend the flames weren't real. JD nodded once, not with satisfaction, but with respect. And then quietly he turned and walked back to his seat. The hand, offered once, was no longer needed, because it had already done its job. It reminded the room, the audience, and maybe even Jasmine herself, that the difference between vengeance and accountability was how you choose to end the story. And this story wasn't quite over yet. For a moment, the room didn't breathe. JD had turned away, his hand now back by his side, already halfway to his chair when it happened. A soft shuffle, a step. Then lightly, slowly, Jasmine Crockett extended her own hand across the space that still lingered between them. He noticed, paused, and turned back. Their hands met, briefly, silently. No grip for the cameras, no rehearsed show of unity, just a connection made without words somewhere between acknowledgement and restraint. She didn't look at him directly. Her eyes were cast downward, not in shame, but in introspection. Her thumb barely moved, tracing an invisible line across his knuckle, then letting go. She said nothing. She didn't have to, and in that moment the crowd was still not sure what they had witnessed. Not an apology, not vindication, but something rare on a political stage, an action born without calculation. Chris Wallace sat in silence, his script forgotten, his mouth opened, closed, then stayed shut. He knew when television had crossed into something else entirely, and from the gallery the camera found her, an elderly black woman in the third row, her hair silver, her blouse pressed, her back proud. She wasn't clapping, she wasn't nodding, she was crying, just one tear at first, then another carving slow paths down cheeks lined with time and knowing. It was the kind of cry that didn't come from sadness, but from exhaustion, from recognition, from that impossible tangle of relief and disappointment that only someone who had seen too much could fully understand. The camera lingered, not for spectacle, for truth, because somehow this woman, unnamed, unscripted, had become the moral lens of the moment. And through her tears, the audience beyond the studio could feel it too. This wasn't about party lines anymore. It was about what happens when people fall short and still reach for something better before the credits roll. On stage, Jasmine turned to face the crowd again, her shoulders squared, not in defiance but in recovery. She didn't try to explain away what had just happened. She didn't dive into spin or narrative. She simply stood there, the spotlight now softer but no less real. And for the first time that night, the audience didn't look at her as a politician or even as the accused. They saw something else, a woman who had weathered the storm, who had been cornered by truth, who had touched humility, if only for a moment, and had not collapsed. Behind the cameras, Wallace finally found his voice. "We will continue our discussion after this short break," he said, but his voice lacked its usual crisp control. It was thinner now, humbled. A man who had just witnessed something unscripted and knew it would stay with him far longer than any policy debate ever could. The studio lights dimmed slightly. Staff moved quietly off stage. The air was different now. Not electric, but reverent. In a world where drama often pretends to be truth, this had been truth pretending, just briefly, to be television. And everyone felt it. At first it was only a few. One man stood, hands in his pockets, head slightly bowed. Not clapping, just standing. Then a woman near the back. Then two more. Their movements weren't coordinated, weren't cued by music or camera angles. There was no prompting, just a quiet rising, like sunlight breaking over horizon no one had noticed darkening. They weren't applauding because someone had won. They were standing because something had been restored. In a studio that had just minutes ago been electric with tension, the air had shifted into something weightier, less performative, more sacred, as if those seated had just witnessed something politics rarely allows, a confrontation that led not to a pile of wreckage, but to a clearing, a space where integrity, not vengeance, had the last word. JD didn't wave or smile. He simply stood there, hands calmly folded in front of him, as the applause built around him. Not for show, not even for him necessarily. It was for what he had refused to become, for what he hadn't said when he easily could have, for the restraint he showed in a world starving for spectacle, for the way he had offered a hand, not to bury an opponent, but to remind them that accountability can be a doorway, not just a sentence. He didn't just bring receipts, someone whispered near the sound booth. He brought decency. That line traveled. Someone tweeted it. Then someone echoed it. And by the time the credits rolled, it was trending faster than any scandal. Hashtag decency over drama. Hashtag JDR receipts turned into hashtag JDR reminded us. Even Wallace, a veteran of decades of televised political combat, felt something unshakable settle in his chest. He'd seen blow-ups, mic drops, walkouts, but rarely this, a moment when a guest had the ammunition to humiliate and chose instead to instruct. No monologue, no finishing blow, just the quiet strength of letting the facts speak and then letting silence do the rest. In the wings, producers were frantically discussing follow-up interviews, fact-checking statements, and prepping for the inevitable media firestorm. But in the center of the studio, it was as if all that noise hadn't yet arrived. JD glanced at Crockett, who remained seated. She didn't look broken. She looked still. The kind of stillness that follows an earthquake, not just of embarrassment, but of realization. No one was cheering for her fall. They weren't celebrating his rise. They were responding to something far rarer, a civic moment that felt unmanufactured, human, unedited. One by one, the audience began clapping, not loud, not fast, but rhythmic, like a pulse, a thank you, a prayer maybe, in a time that had forgotten how to pray without irony. And that sound, that slow, steady sound, reverberated beyond the stage, into living rooms, into feeds, into quiet corners of the country where people were tired of shouting and starving for someone to just hold a line. Not a party line, a human one. And for a fleeting second in that studio, they remembered what politics could feel like when truth didn't come with applause, but earned it anyway. The sun rose quietly over Washington, D.C., but nothing about the media landscape that morning was quiet. CNN's Chiron read in bold white, "Truth delivered quietly." Fox News, not to be outdone, ran with, "The gentleman who didn't need to shout." MSNBC's tone was reverent, almost stunned, a different kind of takedown. Every network, every paper, every platform had caught the moment. But more remarkably, none had twisted it. There was nothing salacious to amplify, no screaming match to loop endlessly. Instead, there was only that single stretch of minutes, measured, restrained, devastating in its composure. Clips of JD calmly walking back to his seat played on repeat. Commentators leaned in not to decipher strategy, but to dissect tone. How someone could unearth such damning evidence without a shred of mockery. How, in a world addicted to humiliation, he had chosen something else, stillness. Pundits fumbled for comparisons. Was it Atticus Finch? Was it Obama at Charleston? Was it too soon to use words like presidential? Meanwhile, J.D. Vance stayed silent. Producers flooded his team with requests, morning shows, Sunday panels, exclusive segments. Some offered full hours. One promised a town hall in his honor. He declined them all. Instead, his team issued a single-line press release to every major outlet. "I didn't come to destroy anyone. I came to remind us what public service should look like." That was it. No follow-up, no clarification, no social media posts to boost reach. The brevity only added to the mystique. In an age of oversharing and overexposure, JD had delivered what no algorithm could anticipate: restraint. And in doing so, he broke the internet, not with volume, but with silence. Even critics found themselves confused. Some on the left tried to label the confrontation as calculated theater, but couldn't explain the absence of self-promotion. Some on the right bristled at his civility, but quietly admitted they hadn't felt this proud of a Republican in years. And in living rooms across America, red states, blue states, and everything frayed between, people replayed the moment, not because they had to, but because they wanted to believe in something again. In Birmingham, a retired judge watched from his kitchen table and whispered, "That's how we used to do it." In Des Moines, a civics teacher rewrote her Monday lesson plan on the spot. In Detroit, a mother paused the segment, called her teenage son over and said, "Watch this." Just watch. There were no trending scandals that day, No late-night monologues roasting the moment into parody. The story wasn't funny, it wasn't outrageous, it was grounded. And that grounding spread through headlines, through group chats, through classrooms and churches and community centers that had long since tuned out. Because something had been reintroduced the night before. Not just facts, not just civility, but a possibility that leadership didn't have to scream, didn't have to smear, didn't have to sacrifice dignity to make a point. It could stand. And sometimes, when done right, it could stand so firmly that even silence would echo louder than 1,000 sound bites. By Monday afternoon, the headlines had quieted, but the gears of governance had begun to move. The House Ethics Committee launched a formal inquiry into the treatment of James Keller and other internal whistleblowers. The language of the resolution was stern but surgical. No names were explicitly mentioned, but everyone knew who the shadows were cast upon. Crockett didn't issue a statement. She didn't protest the investigation. Instead, her actions spoke volumes. By Tuesday, her name had been quietly withdrawn from 3 key subcommittees. The press noticed, but her office declined comment. Allies offered boilerplate defenses, but few came forward with energy. Something had shifted. Respect remained. Deference did not. In the Capitol, people spoke in hushed tones, not out of scandal, but reverence. The tone was different this time. This wasn't a takedown fueled by vengeance or a leak designed to humiliate. This was a course correction, one done in full daylight, on national television, with the kind of restraint that left no one untouched. J.D. returned to his Senate office without fanfare. A staffer brought him a folder. Inside were early drafts of a legislative proposal. He'd been thinking about it for months, long before Keller walked into that studio. Now it had a name, the Whistleblower Immunity Restoration Act. It proposed tighter federal protections for internal agency reporters. It expanded coverage for contracted security personnel and codified response timelines when a report is filed. It closed the procedural loopholes that had allowed Keller's case and so many others to be buried under red tape in retaliation. J.D. didn't pitch it with a press conference. He introduced it on the floor with calm clarity. No fireworks, no moral grandstanding, just the facts in the story that America had already watched unfold in real time. Across the aisle, a few Democrats nodded. By week's end, 5 had signed on as co-sponsors. In private conversations, even skeptics admitted, this wasn't political theater. It was policy born from consequence. The media coverage faded. The trending tags moved on. But something lingered in the halls of power, an awareness that leadership had been redefined, not by shouting, but by showing. And though no one said it aloud, a question hovered just beneath the marble and microphones. What if more of us governed like that? On a quiet Thursday morning, sunlight poured into a high school civics classroom in rural Ohio. The walls were lined with faded posters of past presidents, Supreme Court justices, and famous quotes about liberty. A small television wheeled in from the corner, played a clip from last week's hearing, the moment J.D. Vance extended his hand across the divide, offering dignity instead of condemnation. The class sat unusually still. These were juniors, restless, skeptical, unimpressed by most things that came through a screen. But something about the moment held them. The silence, the restraint, the absence of showmanship. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it, and what he chose not to say. Their teacher, Ms. Landers, paused the video and turned to face them. This, she said gently, is what it looks like when someone defends the truth the right way. Not by yelling, not by tearing others down, but by standing firm, even when it's hard. One student raised his hand, a boy who usually sat in the back, hoodie up, earbuds barely out. Was he famous before all this? He asked. Ms. Landers smiled, just a little. No, she said, he wasn't. Not really. Not in the way we usually define fame. She glanced back at the paused image on the screen. J.D. standing at the podium, steady, not triumphant, but resolute. But now, she added, her voice softer, he's unforgettable. Not because of who he defeated, but because of how he showed up when it mattered. The bell rang, chairs scraped, backpacks zipped, but the weight of the moment lingered. A few students looked back at the screen before leaving. their expressions thoughtful in a way that wasn't common for a Thursday morning. Outside, life moved on. The headlines had long shifted to other names, other arguments, other battles. But somewhere, in a classroom, in a town hall, in a quiet conversation over dinner, the story still echoed. Not as a scandal, not as a spectacle, but as a reminder. That character isn't proven when the cameras are rolling. It's proven when you could have crushed someone and chose instead to stand beside them. And sometimes what remains isn't applause. It's the silence people carry with them, long after the noise has faded. This story reminds us that real strength isn't loud. It's steady, principled, and often quiet. JD didn't win by attacking, but by standing firm with grace. In a world obsessed with headlines, he chose integrity over spectacle. It's a reminder that how we fight for truth matters just as much as the truth itself. What about you? Have you ever had to choose between being right and doing what's right? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.